I was alone, deep in the woods, farther than I had ever been before. I had planned this trip for months, waiting for the right weekend, checking weather reports, making sure I had enough supplies. I wanted to be out here, isolated, away from people, just me and the quiet. I packed everything I needed: tent, food, water, a map, a compass, extra clothes, my knife, and my rifle. I wasn't hunting, but I always carried a rifle when I was this deep in the wild. It wasn't fear, just common sense. The first day was good. The air was crisp, the ground dry, the sky open. I moved deeper than I had planned, crossing an old logging road and following a creek that twisted through thick trees. The woods felt untouched. No trash, no boot prints, just nature. It was exactly what I wanted. I set up camp on a small rise near the creek, clearing away loose branches and pine needles before pitching my tent. The wind was light, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. I cooked a small meal on my stove, ate slowly, and watched the sky darken. I stayed up a little longer than I should have, just listening. The woods made noise, but not the kind that felt unnatural. The wind through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch, the distant call of an owl. Normal sounds. I went to sleep feeling comfortable. Sometime in the night, I woke up. No reason, no sound that I could remember, just awake, staring at the fabric of my tent in the dark. I listened. The wind had died down. The woods weren't completely silent, but they were still. I stayed like that for a while, breathing slow, waiting. Nothing happened. Eventually, I went back to sleep. Morning came and I felt fine. I made coffee, ate a small breakfast, and packed up. My plan was to go even deeper, spend another night even farther in, then loop back the next day. I checked my compass, adjusted my pack, and started moving. By midday, I reached a stretch of forest that felt different. The trees were older, thicker, packed closer together. The light barely reached the ground, and the air smelled different, damp, stale, like old wood. I didn't think much of it at first. I had been in plenty of woods, and some places just felt different. I kept going. After another hour, I noticed something strange. The ground had changed. The soft dirt and leaves I had been walking on were replaced by something harder. Packed earth, almost like a trail, but not one that looked man-made. There were no clear footprints, no signs of tire tracks or boot marks, just a smooth, narrow path cutting through the trees. I hesitated but kept walking. I figured it was an old game trail. Maybe animals had packed it down over time. I followed it for a while, using it to move faster. The forest around me stayed the same, thick, dark, quiet. The farther I went, the more I felt like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. Then I saw something that made me stop. A tree ahead of me, tall and wide, had deep, uneven marks carved into the bark. Not normal scratches. They weren't from an animal. The cuts were deep, rough, made by something sharp. A knife, maybe an axe. But they weren't clean and they weren't even. Just long, jagged lines running across the bark like someone had hacked at it with no real purpose. I moved closer, running my fingers over the marks. The cuts weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a few weeks, a month at most. The wood beneath was still pale. I looked around. No other trees had marks like this. Just this one. A feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't sure why. There was nothing threatening about a damaged tree, but something about it made me feel watched. I stepped back, looking around, listening. Nothing. I kept moving. The deeper I went, the worse the feeling got. The woods didn't feel right anymore. The air felt heavier, thicker. My own footsteps sounded too loud. Every so often, I'd hear something behind me. A small sound, barely there. A twig snapping, leaves shifting. But every time I stopped, it stopped too. I wasn't alone. I turned around more than once, scanning the trees, gripping my rifle a little tighter. I saw nothing. Then I found the cabin. It was small, almost hidden between the trees, the wood dark and rotting. The roof sagged, the door hung slightly open. It looked abandoned. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on dead leaves. There were no trails leading to it, no signs that anyone had been here in years. But the door, it was open just enough to make me uneasy. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked back the way I came. But I didn't. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Damp, rotting wood, stale air. The floor was covered in debris, leaves, dirt, bits of broken glass. There was a small table, a chair, and in the corner, an old cot with a filthy, stained blanket. The walls were scratched, covered in marks like the tree outside. Then I saw the bones. Small ones, scattered near the door. Not human, probably from a deer, maybe a rabbit. But they weren't just there by accident. They had been arranged, placed in a rough, uneven circle. Something was wrong here. I backed out fast, my heartbeat in my ears. As I stepped off the porch, I heard it, a sound from deep in the woods. Something moving, not an animal, not the wind. Something heavy, deliberate, footsteps. I turned and walked fast, gripping my rifle, trying to stay calm. The sound followed, slow at first, then faster. I didn't look back. I moved as quickly as I could, retracing my steps, my breathing tight. The footsteps behind me didn't stop. Then I ran. I ran hard, lungs burning, heart pounding. The sound behind me stayed, never too close but never far enough away. The woods blurred past me, trees cutting at my arms, my legs screaming for me to stop. But I didn't. I didn't stop until I saw my old campsite, the creek, the familiar rise of land where I had slept the night before. Only then did the footsteps behind me fade. I collapsed, hands on my knees, gasping for air. The woods were silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my rifle close, staring into the trees, waiting. By dawn, I was moving, fast. I didn't stop until I was back on the old logging road, back where I felt safe. I never went back to that part of the woods. I don't know what I found, who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I wasn't supposed to be there, and whatever was watching me, it didn't want me to leave, but I did. I had been hunting alone for years. It wasn't just about the hunt. It was the isolation, the quiet. Out there, deep in the woods, there was no one to bother me, no noise except the wind through the trees, the crack of twigs underfoot, the distant calls of birds. It was a break from everything. No roads, no people, just me and nature. I had picked a spot far from anywhere, somewhere even experienced hikers didn't go. It was deep, miles past any marked trail, where the trees grew thick and the ground was uneven. I planned to stay for a few days, enough time to track and take down something worthwhile. I packed everything I needed: my rifle, extra rounds, a knife, food, water, a tent, and enough supplies to keep me safe if the weather turned. I knew the risks. I had been in woods like these before, and I knew how easy it was to get lost if you weren't careful. But I was careful. I set out early, following an old game trail that cut through the trees. The first day went as expected. I covered a good distance, keeping an eye out for fresh tracks, looking for signs of movement. I found a few: a set of deer tracks near a stream, the faint trail of a boar cutting through some undergrowth, but nothing worth stopping for. By late afternoon, I had reached a clearing, just wide enough for my tent. I set up fast, got a fire going, ate a quick meal, and sat back, listening to the woods settle. The night air was cool, the wind low, the fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. It was peaceful. I slept light, like I always did when I was alone. A few times I woke up listening. The woods made their usual noises: branches shifting, leaves moving, something small scurrying through the underbrush. Normal sounds. But once, just before dawn, I heard something different. A snap. Not close, but not far either. A branch breaking. A heavy one. I stayed still, listening. Nothing followed.
No footsteps, no rustling.
Just silence. Maybe a tree limb had fallen. Maybe an animal had stepped wrong. Either way, there was nothing to do but wait for morning. When the sun rose, I packed up and moved out. The woods felt the same, quiet, undisturbed, but as I walked, I kept thinking about that sound. It had been too sharp, too deliberate. Something had made it. A few hours in, I found something strange. A set of boot prints, barely visible in the soft dirt. They were old, maybe a few weeks, half washed away by rain. They didn't lead anywhere, just a few steps, then gone. I wasn't expecting to find boot prints this deep. I had checked maps before coming out here, and as far as I knew, there was nothing nearby. No cabins, no old logging camps, nothing. But someone had been here. I moved on. The day was slow. No fresh tracks, no signs of anything worth hunting. Just more trees, more silence. By mid-afternoon, I reached another clearing, smaller than the last. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and half-rotten logs. It wasn't a good place to set up camp, but something caught my eye. Something half-buried near the edge of the clearing. A trap. An old one, rusted and broken, the metal teeth bent and dull. It looked like it had been there for years. I crouched, running my fingers over the twisted metal. It was a bear trap, or at least it had been. The spring was busted, the mechanism frozen with rust. Then I saw something worse. Blood. Not fresh, but not old either. Dried, dark, caught in the hinges, smeared across the metal. My first thought was an animal had gotten caught and struggled free. But the more I looked, the less sense that made. There were no bones, no fur, no sign of a struggle. Just blood. And then, nearby, something else. A piece of rope, half buried in the dirt. I pulled it free. It was thick, rough, the kind used for tying down heavy loads. The end was frayed, like it had been cut or torn. I stood up, looking around. The woods were still. The clearing was empty. I had a bad feeling, the kind that settles in your stomach and doesn't leave. I backed away, turned, and walked fast. I didn't stop until I was deep in the trees again, far from that clearing. The rest of the day, I moved quickly, pushing farther than I had planned. I needed distance, even if I didn't have a reason I could explain. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I set up camp in a thick patch of trees, kept my rifle close, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up again. Not to a sound, not to movement, to silence. The kind of silence that shouldn't be there. No wind, no night calls, nothing. Just dead, heavy stillness. I stayed like that for hours, staring at the darkness, my hand tight around my rifle. I don't remember falling asleep, but when morning came, I was still alive.
I packed fast.
I was done. Whatever I had found, whoever had been out here before me, I didn't want to know. I turned back the way I came, moving fast, not stopping. Then, hours later, I found something I shouldn't have. A boot print. Fresh.
Mine.
I stopped cold. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my compass, my map. I checked everything. I had been walking in a straight line. I knew these woods. I had tracked every step. But somehow I had looped back to where I had been before, back to the trap. It was still there, rusted and broken, the blood dried in its teeth. Only now it wasn't alone. Next to it, in the dirt, was something new. A fresh piece of rope, coiled neatly. And next to that, footprints. Not mine. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when branches tore at my arms. Not when my legs screamed. I ran until my lungs burned, until I saw the old game trail, until I reached the edge of the woods. Only then did I stop. Only then did I turn. The woods behind me were still, empty, silent. I didn't wait. I got in my truck, drove fast, and didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they were doing, what the trap was for, why the rope was left behind. But I know one thing. They were watching, and they wanted me to know it. I had always been comfortable in the woods. I grew up around them, spent more time in them than I did in town. Hunting, fishing, hiking, whatever excuse I had to get away, I took it. Out there, I didn't have to deal with people. Didn't have to listen to cars, voices, all the noise that came with civilization. It was just me and the quiet. That's why I planned this trip. A week alone, deep in the woods, farther than I'd ever been before. I wasn't afraid. I had done solo trips plenty of times. I knew how to read a map, how to track my movements, how to keep myself from getting lost. This was supposed to be like any other trip. Peaceful, quiet, a chance to be alone. It wasn't. Day one I started early, before the sun had fully risen. I had parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road, packed my gear, and set off. The plan was simple. Hike in for 2 days, set up camp, then spend the rest of the week exploring. I had enough food and water to last, a rifle for hunting, a knife, a map, a compass. Everything I needed. The first day was normal. The forest was thick but manageable. The air cool and damp from rain the night before. The only tracks I saw belonged to animals, deer, maybe a boar. I followed a stream for a while, using it as a natural guide, then veered off once I found a good spot to make camp. I set up in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees. The ground was mostly flat, dry enough that I wouldn't wake up in mud if it rained. I got a fire going, ate a quick meal, then sat back, listening to the woods. Felt normal.
Familiar.
I slept easy that night. Day 2, I moved deeper the next morning. Packed up, checked my compass, kept going. The trees grew thicker, the ground more uneven. I climbed over fallen logs, pushed through underbrush, always keeping track of where I was. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. By midday, I noticed something strange. The trees ahead of me weren't normal. Their bark was stripped in places, deep gashes carved into the wood. It wasn't natural. No animal had done it. The cuts were deliberate, rough, like someone had hacked at them with a knife or axe. I stopped, listening. The woods were still. No wind, no rustling leaves.
No birds.
Just silence. I kept moving. An hour later, I found the clearing. It wasn't on my map. Shouldn't have been there. The trees opened up into a perfect circle. The ground flat and bare, like nothing had ever grown there.
No grass, no bushes.
Just dirt, dark and damp, like it had been turned over recently. In the center, there was a hole, deep, wide enough that I couldn't see the bottom. The edges were rough, the dirt freshly dug. Next to it, something worse. A shovel. Old, rusted, the handle worn smooth from use. Someone had dug this hole. Someone had been here. Recently. I turned and left fast, moving quicker than I had all day. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I didn't sleep well that night. Day 3, I woke up early, packed my gear, and started back. I wasn't staying the full week anymore. The woods didn't feel the same. I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. The trees seemed closer together, the air thicker, the quiet heavier. By noon, I was back near the stream I had followed on my first day. I recognized the area. I was close to where I had camped that first night. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. My fire pit, the one I had built my first night. Only it wasn't how I had left it. The ashes were gone. The rocks I had placed in a circle were disturbed, scattered. And in the center, pressed into the dirt, was a footprint. Not mine. I didn't wait. I walked fast, pushing through branches, barely checking my map. I needed to get out. Day 4, I should have been close to my truck. But I wasn't. Somehow I had gone the wrong way. I checked my map again, my compass, retraced my steps. But nothing made sense. I was moving in circles. The trees looked the same. The ground looked the same. I kept ending up in places I had already been. And then, late in the afternoon, I found the clearing again. The same one. The hole was still there. But this time it wasn't empty. Something was inside. I stepped closer, looking down. A bag. Large, heavy, bulging. It was tied shut with thick rope. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The smell told me everything I needed to know. Rot. Something inside was dead. Something big. I turned and ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, not caring if I tripped, not caring if I was making noise. I ran until my legs burned, until my chest felt like it was going to burst. I didn't stop until night fell. Then, in the dark, I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not something small. Something heavy. Moving slow. Deliberate. I gripped my rifle, barely breathing. The sound moved closer. Then it stopped. For hours, I stayed like that, my back against a tree, my rifle aimed at the dark. I didn't sleep. Day 5 at first light, I moved. I didn't care about the map anymore. I just needed to go. I walked fast, nearly running, not stopping for anything. By midday, I saw something through the trees. A road, not a big one, not paved, just a dirt track cutting through the forest. But it was something. I followed it, moving as fast as I could. Then finally I saw it, my truck, right where I had left it. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced at the tree line one last time. There was nothing there. No movement, no sound, just trees. But I knew. Someone had been following me. Someone had been out there watching, waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I had been planning this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet week in the woods. Just me, my gear, and nothing but time. No work, no people, no stress. I wanted isolation. I wanted the silence that only the deep woods could give me. I had picked a spot far from anywhere, deeper than most hikers or hunters ever went. There were no marked trails, no cabins, no old logging roads, just thick, unbroken forest. I had studied the maps, planned my route, packed everything I needed. I had done trips like this before. I wasn't worried. I should have been. Day 1 I started early, parked my truck at the end of an old dirt road, and hiked in. The forest was thick, the air damp from recent rain. I followed an old game trail, barely visible under the leaves, moving slow, careful to mark my route. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No traffic noise, no distant hum of civilization, just the woods. By mid-afternoon, I found a good spot. A small clearing, not too open, surrounded by thick trees. I set up my tent, built a fire, ate a quick meal, and sat back, listening. Everything felt normal, peaceful. I fell asleep fast. Day 2, I moved deeper the next day, taking only my rifle, some food, and a small pack. I wanted to explore, maybe find a better place to set up long-term. I marked my trail, keeping track of every step. A few hours in, I found something strange. A cabin. It wasn't on my map. It shouldn't have been there. It was old, half-rotted, the wood dark with age. The roof sagged. The windows were gone. The door hung open. There were no signs of recent use. No tracks, no smoke from a chimney. Nothing. I stepped closer, looking inside. Empty. A single room, bare except for an old wood stove and a broken chair. Dust covered everything. The air inside was stale, undisturbed. Something about it felt off. I turned and left fast, marking the spot on my map but deciding not to go back. I hiked in a wide loop, making sure I wasn't near it when I set up camp again that night. I didn't sleep as well. Day 3, I woke up to silence. Not just the usual quiet of the deep woods, but a heavier silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. I packed fast, moving again, heading back toward my original camp. That's when I found the footprints. Not mine. Fresh, deep, leading from the direction of the cabin. They had stopped about 20 feet from my tent. Just stopped, like whoever made them had stood there watching, then turned around and left. I didn't stay. I packed everything and moved fast, pushing toward the edge of the woods, toward where my truck was parked. But by late afternoon, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't getting closer. I checked my map, my compass. They said I was going the right way, but the terrain didn't match. The land was wrong. The trees were wrong. Somehow I had gotten turned around. Somehow I was deeper than before. I set up camp again as the sun started to set. I kept my rifle close. Day 4, I woke up to a sound. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something moving. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It was close. Just outside my tent. A crunch of leaves. A shift of weight. Then silence. I stayed like that for hours, gripping my rifle, not moving. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out. The woods were empty, but the footprints were back. Closer this time. Whoever it was had been right outside. Watching. Waiting. I started walking, not stopping, not resting. I should have reached my truck by noon. I didn't. By evening, I knew I was lost. I had been marking my path, following my compass, moving straight. But I wasn't going anywhere. Day 5, I found the cabin again. I don't know how. I wasn't trying to find it. I should have been miles away. But there it was. The door was open now, wider than before, like it was waiting. I didn't go inside. I didn't stop. I kept walking, faster now, ignoring the ache in my legs, the hunger in my stomach. I walked until nightfall, until my body gave up and I had to rest. I built a fire, bigger than usual, and sat with my rifle in my lap, staring into the trees. I didn't sleep. Day 6, I woke up to movement. The fire was out. The woods were wrong. Darker. Closer. The footprints were back. Right up to where I had been sitting. Then past. Whoever it was had walked up to me, stood over me, then kept going. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would snap. Then, just as the sun started to rise, I saw something through the trees. A road. Not a big one. Just a narrow dirt track. But it was something. I followed it, moving as fast as I could. Then finally I saw it, my truck. Right where I had left it. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced at the tree line one last time. There was nothing there. No movement. No sound. Just trees. But I knew. Someone had been following me. Someone had been out there watching, waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I had planned this trip for months. The goal was simple. Spend a week alone, deep in the woods, farther than I'd ever gone before. I wasn't new to this. I'd spent countless nights camping, hiking, hunting. I knew how to navigate, how to handle myself, how to be alone in the wild. The idea of isolation never bothered me. In fact, I craved it. No people, no noise, no distractions. Just me and the forest. I picked a spot far beyond the normal hiking trails. No marked paths, no cabins, no signs of civilization. Just thick, untouched wilderness. It was perfect. At least that's what I thought. Day 1, I started early, just after sunrise. I parked my truck at the edge of an old dirt road, slung my pack over my shoulders, and walked into the trees. The plan was to hike in for 2 full days, set up a base camp, and then spend the rest of the week exploring. The first few hours went smoothly. The forest was dense but manageable. I followed a stream for a while, using it as a natural guide, then veered off when the terrain looked right. I marked my path carefully, carving small notches into trees every so often. By mid-afternoon, I found a good clearing. The ground was dry, the area was quiet. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and ate a quick meal. Felt normal.
Familiar.
I slept well. Day 2, I woke early, packed light, and moved deeper into the woods. I had no specific destination, just exploration. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. By noon, I noticed something strange. The forest started to feel wrong. The trees all looked the same, tall, thick, with rough gray bark. I knew that was normal, but something about it unsettled me. It was as if I had been walking in place, seeing the same trees again and again. Then I found the first marker I had made that morning. That shouldn't have been possible. I had been walking in a straight line. I checked my compass, my map. Everything said I was moving forward, but somehow I had looped back. I tried again. This time I paid extra attention to my direction, making sure every step was precise. 2 hours later, I ended up in the same place. Something was wrong. I didn't panic. I took a deep breath, marked the area more clearly, and tried once more. But no matter which way I went, I always ended up back at the same spot. It didn't make sense. The sun started to set, so I decided to head back to camp. I followed my markers. They led nowhere. Every mark I had made that morning was gone. I should have been able to retrace my steps, but the woods had changed. My camp was gone. I spent an hour searching, but everything looked the same. My tent, my gear, my fire pit vanished. It was as if I had never set it up at all. I had no choice but to build a new camp. I set up my small emergency tent, made another fire, and tried to ignore the growing feeling of unease. That night, I barely slept. Day 3, I woke up feeling exhausted. The night had been restless, filled with strange sounds, soft rustling, distant snapping branches. I told myself it was just animals. I needed to find my way back to my truck. I took out my compass again, made a plan, and started walking. By noon, I found something that stopped me cold. Footprints. Not mine. They were deep, fresh, leading in a wide loop through the trees. They weren't from an animal. They were human, but I hadn't seen another person for days. I followed them, moving slow, my heart pounding. They led me to another clearing, and in the middle of it, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A campsite, not mine, a different one. A tent, a fire pit, scattered gear. I stepped closer, my skin crawling. Everything was covered in dirt, leaves, and moss, as if it had been abandoned for years. The tent was sagging, half collapsed. A backpack lay nearby, torn open. I looked inside. There was a jacket, a few empty food cans, a notebook. I picked up the notebook, brushing off the dirt. The first few pages were filled with normal entries, dates, notes about the weather, descriptions of hikes. Then the writing changed. The last few pages were frantic, messy. I keep going in circles. The woods are different. The trees are wrong. I saw someone last night, watching me. I don't think I'm alone. The final entry was short. If you find this, turn back. Don't go any further. I dropped the notebook and stepped away. I needed to leave. Now, day 4, I walked all day. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to rest. I followed my compass, moving as fast as I could. But no matter how far I went, I never reached the edge of the woods. The trees never thinned. The terrain never changed. It was as if the forest had no end. By nightfall, I was exhausted. My legs ached. My throat was dry. I built a small fire and sat with my back against a tree, gripping my knife, listening. Then, in the silence, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not an animal. Someone walking. I didn't move. The footsteps circled my camp, just beyond the firelight. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched. Then, just as I thought whoever it was had gone, I heard something worse. Breathing. Close. Right behind me. I spun, knife in hand. Nothing was there. The woods were empty. But I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep at all. Day 5 I moved at first light, walking faster than ever. Then, around midday, I saw something through the trees. A road. My heart pounded as I ran toward it, barely believing what I was seeing. It was narrow, just a dirt path cutting through the trees, but it was real. I followed it, moving as fast as I could. Then, finally, I saw it, my truck, right where I had left it. I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack in the back, climbed inside, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced at the tree line one last time. The woods were still. No movement, no sound, just trees. But I knew something had been following me. Something had been watching. And whatever it was, it had let me go. This time. I had been hiking alone for years. There was something about being out in the deep woods that I loved. Something peaceful about the quiet, about the way the world felt untouched. No crowds, no noise, just me and the land. This trip was supposed to be the same. I had planned everything like I always did. A 5-day solo hike through the most isolated stretch of forest I could find. I had checked the maps, packed carefully, and made sure everything was in order. But none of it mattered, because by the 3rd day I was lost, and I wasn't alone. It started like any other trip. I drove as far as the roads would take me, parked my truck at a remote trailhead, and stepped into the woods. The first day was uneventful. Just miles of thick trees, winding paths, the crunch of leaves under my boots. I moved deep into the forest, farther than most people ever went, making my way toward a small valley marked on my map. It was supposed to have good camping spots, fresh water, and plenty of open space. By the 2nd night, I reached it. It was even better than I expected. The trees opened up into a wide clearing, a shallow creek running through the center. I set up my tent near the water, built a fire, and watched the sunset behind the hills. Everything felt right, but that night something changed. I woke up to a sound. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sounds of the woods: deer, owls, coyotes in the distance. This was different. It was soft, steady, a faint rustling, like something moving through the brush. I sat up, listening. It stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. After a long minute, I laid back down. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth near my tent. They circled my campsite, moving slow, deliberate. I followed them a few yards before they vanished into the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. I was miles from the nearest trail. No one should have been out here. I checked my gear, made sure nothing was missing, then forced myself to keep moving. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe I had made the tracks myself without realizing it. But deep down, I knew better. By midday, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, the silence deeper than before. The birds had stopped. The usual sounds of the woods, leaves rustling, branches creaking, were gone. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then I saw it. A cabin. It wasn't on my map. I wasn't even sure how I had found it. The wood was dark, damp, the roof sagging in places. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I should have kept walking, but I didn't. I stepped closer, slow, careful. The door was open just slightly. Inside, dust covered everything. An old table sat in the center of the room, a rusted stove in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, empty except for a few broken jars. Then I saw the carvings, scratched into the wooden walls, deep, rough. "Don't stay. Don't look." Don't follow. The words sent a chill through me. I turned, stepping back outside, my skin crawling. The woods were silent, too silent. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move. I had to get out of here. I picked a direction and walked. Fast. An hour passed, then another. But no matter how far I went, nothing changed. The trees all looked the same. The ground never shifted. I checked my map, my compass. Both were useless. It was like the forest had swallowed the trail, leaving nothing behind. Then I saw it. Through the trees. The cabin. Again. Exactly the same. I stopped cold, my blood turning to ice. I had walked straight for 2 hours. This wasn't possible. I turned, heart hammering, and walked faster. I didn't stop until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. Then I looked up. The cabin. Still there, like it had been waiting for me. I didn't sleep that night. I built a fire, sat with my back against a tree, and gripped my knife tight. Somewhere in the dark, something moved. Not close, not yet, but there. I could feel it. Watching, waiting. By the 4th day, I was running out of food. I had to find a way out. I moved fast, cutting through the undergrowth, ignoring the branches that scraped at my arms. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then finally I saw it. A road. Not much, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the trees. But it was real. I followed it, moving as fast as I could. Then, after what felt like hours, I saw something through the trees. My truck. Right where I had left it. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear in the back, climbed inside, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced at the tree line one last time. The woods were still. No movement, no sound, just trees. But I knew something had been following me. Something had been watching. And whatever it was, it had let me go. This time. The woods had always been a second home to me. I grew up around them, hunting with my dad before I was even old enough to hold a rifle, learning how to track, how to read the land, how to move through it without disturbing a thing. There was something about being out there, away from everything, that made me feel like I belonged. It was quiet in a way the world never was. Peaceful, even. That's why, when I had a week off work, I decided to take my pack and head deep into the forest, farther than I had ever gone before. It wasn't unusual for me to spend days out there alone, moving through miles of untouched wilderness, camping where the land allowed. But this time, I wanted to push myself. I wanted to go beyond the places I knew, beyond the old logging roads and the hunting trails, past the areas where even the most experienced outdoorsmen rarely set foot. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be back in a week. I loaded up my pack with enough supplies to last me 10 days, just in case. Food, water, my rifle, a good knife, a first aid kit, extra clothes, fire-starting materials, a compass, a map, everything I needed. I had been in worse conditions before. I wasn't worried. The first 3 days were everything I had hoped for. The land was untouched, wild in a way I had rarely seen. No trails, no signs of people, just endless forest stretching in every direction. I followed game trails when I could, waded through deep creeks when I had to, and climbed up steep ridges to get a better view of the land ahead. The nights were cold, but I built good fires and my gear kept me warm. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional call of an owl, and the rustling of animals in the undergrowth. It was exactly what I had wanted. Then, on the 4th day, I found something strange. I had been following a creek upstream for most of the morning, looking for a good place to refill my water bottles, when I saw it. A boot print in the mud. It wasn't fresh, maybe a few days old, but it was clear. A human boot print, deep in the wet earth. That shouldn't have been there. I was miles away from any known trails, in a place where no one had any reason to be. I had seen no other signs of people, no old campsites, no trash, nothing. And yet, someone had been here recently. I crouched down, studying the print. It was large, maybe a size 12 or 13, and heavy. Whoever left it had been carrying a lot of weight. I scanned the ground around it, looking for more. There, another print a few feet ahead, and another beyond that, following the creek just like I had been. I hesitated, then decided to follow them. For the next half-mile, I tracked the prints. They were uneven, the stride length changing frequently, as if whoever had left them had been limping or unsteady. At times, they veered off into the brush before returning to the creek. More than once, I saw places where the person had slipped, the mud disturbed in wide, frantic patterns. Then suddenly they stopped. I stood there, staring at the last print, my stomach twisting. The ground ahead was undisturbed. No more prints, no sign of where the person had gone. It was as if they had simply vanished. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest around me. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The woods felt different now, quieter, heavier. I had spent my whole life in places like this, but at that moment, I felt something I never had before. I felt watched. I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. There were explanations for things like this. Maybe they had stepped onto a patch of solid ground, where the earth was too hard to leave prints. Maybe they had climbed up onto the rocks that lined the creek, where no tracks would be left. Maybe they had turned back, retracing their own steps in the same footprints to hide their trail. Or maybe they hadn't left at all. I turned and walked away, faster than I meant to, not caring if I made noise. The feeling of being watched never left me. I hiked until my legs ached, putting as much distance between myself and that spot as I could before making camp for the night. The fire felt smaller than usual, its light not reaching far enough into the dark. I ate quickly, my appetite gone, and crawled into my sleeping bag with my rifle close. The woods were silent, too silent. No insects, no owls, no rustling leaves. Just an endless, suffocating stillness. I barely slept. The next morning, I packed up and started back the way I had come. I had planned to be out for a full week, but something in my gut told me it was time to go home. By midday, I found more tracks. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. They were large, heavy, and they followed my path from the day before. Someone had been walking the same trail I had, moving in the same direction. But what made my stomach turn was the fact that, at some point, the tracks had veered off the path, straight into the trees beside my camp from the night before. Whoever had been following me had stopped there, just beyond the light of my fire, and stood watching. I walked faster. I pushed hard for the rest of the day, covering more miles than I should have. The whole time, I felt that presence just out of sight, like something was pacing me, just beyond the trees. Every so often, I stopped and listened, but there was nothing, just silence. That night, I didn't make a fire. I found a spot against a rock face where nothing could come up behind me, and I sat there, my rifle in my lap, waiting. The darkness pressed in around me, thick and heavy. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I heard it, a branch snapping, not far, maybe 50 feet. Then another, closer. I raised my rifle, aiming into the dark, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no shapes, just that terrible silence, broken only by the sound of someone, moving just beyond my sight. And then, finally, a sound that sent ice through my veins. Breathing, slow, deep, steady. Not an animal, not wind, something close. I sat there, gripping my rifle so hard my fingers ached, until the first light of dawn bled through the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The presence was gone. I didn't waste time. I packed up and moved, hiking nonstop until I reached the first familiar landmark, then kept going. I didn't stop. Not to eat, not to rest. I walked until my legs felt like they would give out, until the trees thinned and the road appeared in the distance. I never looked back. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack inside and drove without stopping, not even to check my map. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't do anything but drive. I haven't been back since. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I don't know how long they had been watching me, or why they never showed themselves. But I know one thing. I wasn't alone.